That was Michael Anthony, okay? 100% dedicated, never did anything to hurt those guys, and they tried to hurt him again and again and again.
He stood on stage next to Eddie Van Halen for over 3 decades, holding down the low end while the guitar solos stole the headlines. Then, one day, he found out he'd been replaced, not through a phone call, not through a handshake, but through whispers, rumors, and internet chatter. Now, in his 70s, Michael Anthony is finally talking. Not with bitterness, but with a kind of hard-won honesty that reframes everything we thought we knew about Van Halen's inner circle. What really happened between him and Eddie? Why did one of rock's most reliable bandmates end up on the outside looking in? Stick around, because this story has more layers than most fans realize. Childhood and the road to the bass. Michael Anthony's relationship with music started at home, long before Van Halen ever existed. His father was a working trumpet player, and the sound of live music drifting through the house became part of Michael's everyday world. It was only natural that he'd pick up an instrument himself, and trumpet was his first love, something he stuck with through school band programs after his family settled in Southern California during the 1960s. But teenage rebellion works in strange ways. Around age 13, Anthony found himself pulled toward rock and roll, and he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of picking up a guitar like everyone else around him, he wanted an instrument that set him apart. He landed on bass. The catch was, he didn't own one. A friend loaned him a guitar, and Anthony improvised, pulling off 2 strings to turn it into a makeshift bass. It wasn't pretty, but it worked, and it was enough to convince his father that his son was serious. Not long after, Anthony's father bought him a real Fender Precision bass and an amp to match, a gesture that many musicians who knew Anthony later pointed to as the true beginning of his career. He studied the greats, Jack Bruce, John Paul Jones, players known for serving the song rather than showing off, and despite being naturally left-handed, he taught himself to play right-hand, which speaks to just how determined he was early on. That discipline would carry him through years of small gigs before Van Halen ever entered the picture. Finding Van Halen. By the early 1970s, Anthony was playing in a band called Snake around the Pasadena and Arcadia club circuit, splitting time between bass duties and lead vocals. It wasn't glamorous work, but it built his stage presence and gave him a local reputation. It also put him in the same orbit as another local band called Mammoth, fronted by 2 brothers who would soon become the most famous siblings in rock, Eddie and Alex Van Halen. The 2 bands crossed paths at shows around town, and according to accounts from that era, one especially memorable night came when Mammoth's sound equipment failed mid-show and Anthony's band stepped in to help. It was a small act of generosity, but it stuck with the Van Halen brothers. Not long after, the bassist left the group, and they reached out to Anthony to see if he'd fit. A jam session, reportedly held in a garage, as so many rock origin stories go, convinced everyone involved that something special was happening. Anthony's steady low end and his knack for backing vocals gave the band a fuller sound than they'd had before. Soon after, the band changed its name from Mammoth to Van Halen, since another act already held that name, and the classic lineup fell into place. David Lee Roth on vocals, Eddie on guitar, Alex on drums, and Michael Anthony on bass. What started as a lineup change for a local band would become one of the most consequential rosters in rock history, building the sound. Through the mid to late 1970s, Van Halen built a reputation on the LA club circuit, playing legendary rooms like the Whiskey A Go-Go, developing the sound that would eventually turn them into a global phenomenon. Anthony's role in that sound is often underappreciated by casual fans, but musicians who've studied the band closely point to his high, piercing backing vocals as one of the group's defining sonic signatures, a contrast to Roth's showmanship and Eddie's guitar pyrotechnics that gave Van Halen's records a fullness few of their peers could match. When the band's self-titled debut dropped in 1978, it became an instant landmark. Tracks like Running with the Devil leaned on Anthony's steady low end, while songs like Jamie's Crying showcased those layered harmonies that became a Van Halen trademark. As the band's popularity exploded through albums like Van Halen 2, Women and Children First, and Fair Warning, Anthony earned a reputation within the industry as one of the most dependable, low-drama members of a band that was often anything but calm behind the scenes. In the band's early years, by most accounts, Anthony was treated as a full and equal partner, sharing in profits, debts, and business decisions alongside the other 3 members. That equal footing wouldn't last forever. The turning point of 1984. 1984 was, on paper, the peak of Van Halen's commercial success. The album of the same name gave the band its biggest hits yet, Jump, Panama, Hard for Teacher, and pushed them into a completely different tier of stardom. But according to the band's former manager Noel Monk, that same period marked a major shift in Michael Anthony's standing within the group. Monk has said publicly that during this era, Anthony was asked to sign new agreements that reduced his songwriting credits and his share of royalties going forward, and that the paperwork was, in some tellings, retroactive, affecting past work as well. Anthony has since confirmed in interviews that he did sign arrangements that changed his financial position in the band, and that he made peace with the decision because keeping the band together and continuing to play music mattered more to him than a fight over paperwork. It's worth being careful here. Accounts of exactly how that moment played out vary depending on who's telling the story, and Anthony himself has generally avoided painting it as a dramatic confrontation when he's spoken about it directly. What's not in dispute is that his financial stake in the band's most successful era ended up far smaller than his creative contribution to it. For years, Anthony didn't talk about any of this publicly. He kept playing, kept touring, and kept his frustrations, if he had them, largely to himself. When Eddie went public, the tension between bandmates doesn't always show up in courtrooms or contracts. Sometimes it shows up in interviews. In 2015, Eddie Van Halen gave comments to Billboard that suggested he'd had to walk Anthony through his bass parts, framing him as a musician who needed instruction rather than one who came prepared. The remarks caught plenty of fans off guard, especially given Anthony's decades of professional, reliable work with the band. Anthony pushed back in later interviews, saying he always learned his own parts and that no such teaching sessions ever happened, and pointing out that if they had, there would presumably be some record or memory of it beyond one comment years later. Whatever the underlying truth, Anthony has said the comments stung, in part because they came from someone he'd known and trusted for most of his adult life. He's described the fallout as something that quietly widened the distance between them, until eventually the two barely spoke at all, fading from the inside. By the time Van Halen recorded 1998's Van Halen 3, Anthony's role in the studio had already started to shrink. He played bass on only a handful of the album's tracks, with Eddie handling much of the rest himself. It wasn't a public firing or dramatic falling out. It was more of a slow erosion, the kind that's easy to miss until you look back and realize how much it changed. That pattern continued into the 2000s, when the band's 2004 Greatest Hits compilation included a few new songs. Anthony's contribution was limited to backing vocals rather than playing bass on the recordings. Around the same time, Anthony took part in the band's 2004 reunion tour with Sammy Hagar, but by his own account and others, the terms had shifted. He agreed to reduce compensation and to a contract that treated him more like a hired player than an equal member, just to be part of the tour at all. That 2004 run would end up being his last with the band. The replacement fans found out about online. In 2006, Van Halen announced a reunion with David Lee Roth, and fans quickly noticed someone missing. Michael Anthony wasn't part of the lineup. In his place was Eddie's teenage son, Wolfgang Van Halen, who would go on to record bass on the band's final studio album and tour with them for years afterward. For a long time, the popular narrative, repeated by fans and press alike, was that Anthony had simply been pushed out, with no warning and no explanation, and that he'd learned about his own replacement through rumors and online chatter rather than a direct conversation. Anthony has said in interviews that it did feel sudden and that communication around the transition was, at best, minimal. More recently, though, Alex Van Halen has offered a different piece of the puzzle. In interviews given in 2026, Alex has said that he and Eddie did try to reach out to Anthony before bringing Wolfgang in, saying they felt they owed him that call, but that Anthony didn't respond. Alex has been fairly direct about this, saying he isn't angry at Anthony but felt the two of them shared a manager and that Anthony could have made more of an effort to stay in the loop. It's a good example of how these stories often have more than one side. The he found out from the internet version and the we called and he didn't pick up version aren't necessarily contradictory, since a single misconnection can look completely different depending on which side of it you're standing on. Either way, the outcome was the same. Michael Anthony's time as Van Halen's bassist was over, and Wolfgang stepped into the role. Life after Van Halen. Anthony didn't disappear from music, far from it. He reunited creatively with Sammy Hagar, the two of them having built real chemistry back in the Van Hagar years. Together they launched The Other Half, a touring act built around Van Halen songs from both the Roth and Hagar eras, giving fans a chance to hear that material performed live again. In 2008, the pairing turned into something bigger. Chickenfoot, a band that also included guitarist Joe Satriani and Red Hot Chili Peppers drummer Chad Smith. Their self-titled debut cracked the top 10 on the Billboard 200, and the band's chemistry earned strong reviews from critics who'd wondered whether Anthony still had gas in the tank after decades in Eddie Van Halen's shadow. A follow-up album a couple of years later reinforced that Chickenfoot wasn't just a side project cashing in on nostalgia. By 2014, Anthony and Hagar were at it again, this time with Sammy Hagar and The Circle, rounding out the lineup with guitarist Vic Johnson and drummer Jason Bonham. The band leaned into a set list spanning Van Halen, Led Zeppelin, and Hagar's solo catalog, and their original material has continued to chart, evidence that Anthony's musical relevance never depended solely on the Van Halen name. More recently, Anthony has stayed busy with Hagar's Best of All Worlds band alongside Joe Satriani and drummer Kenny Aronoff, including a Las Vegas residency, and has continued to make appearances at fan events like Van Halen-themed rock camps. He's also weighed in publicly on the deluxe reissue of 5150, the band's first Sammy Hagar album, saying that he and the band's old engineer have had input into how that project comes together, even without being formally part of Van Halen's current business operations. The tribute tour that never happened. After Eddie Van Halen passed away in October 2020, speculation swirled almost immediately about some kind of tribute tour or reunion to honor him. Alex Van Halen reportedly reached out to former collaborators, including Anthony and Roth, and guitarist Joe Satriani was floated as a possible stand-in for Eddie's parts. For a while, it seemed like there was real momentum. It fell apart for a mix of reasons. Reports suggest David Lee Roth wasn't fully on board with the format being discussed, and Alex Van Halen's own health issues, including a reported back injury in 2022, made a physically demanding tour increasingly unrealistic. Anthony has said he was open to being part of something like that, but the pieces never came together. No tribute tour ever happened, and for many fans, that closed the door on ever seeing the classic-era members share a stage again. More recently, attention has shifted to a different kind of project. Unfinished Van Halen recordings that Alex Van Halen and engineer collaborator Steve Lukather have reportedly been piecing together, built from material tracked before Eddie's death, with Wolfgang playing bass on those sessions. Anthony isn't part of that project, but he has offered his opinion publicly anyway, suggesting that if the band wants to honor Eddie properly, the smartest move would be to release the material as an instrumental tribute rather than trying to find a new singer and turn it into something it was never meant to be. It's a pretty telling comment. Even from outside the band's current operations, Anthony still seems invested in protecting what he sees as the integrity of the music he helped build. A family still protecting the legacy. Eddie's ex-wife, actress Valerie Bertinelli, has been open about her own feelings on how Eddie's story should, or shouldn't, be told. She said she doesn't want a biopic made about him or the band while she's alive, citing concerns that Hollywood would sensationalize his struggles, particularly his battle with addiction, rather than treat his life with care. Their son, Wolfgang Van Halen, has echoed a similar instinct, focusing his own energy on his band Mammoth WVH rather than leaning on his father's legacy for a career boost. He's been candid about the pressure of constantly being compared to his father, and has pushed back against people who he feels exploit Eddie's name for their own attention.